The police evidence warehouse was a cathedral of forgotten sorrows, a vast, windowless expanse of industrial shelving that stretched upward into the humid gloom of the ceiling. I worked in the bowels of Sector 4, where the air tasted of cardboard, old dust, and the sterile metallic tang of chemical preservatives that couldn't quite mask the scent of stale fear clinging to the boxes. My job was a monotonous cycle of cataloguing the debris of broken lives, stained hoodies, shattered glass, and the cold plastic of DNA kits. Yet I felt a strange kinship with these relics, as if I were the librarian of a history the city wanted to burn. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a persistent, nauseating vibration, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across the rows of cold cases, a term the precinct used for the women they had decided weren't worth the overtime. To everyone else, this was just a graveyard of discarded plastic bags, but to me, it was a place where the air felt thick with the unspoken, a heavy pressure against my eardrums that grew more intense the deeper I wandered into the labyrinth. It happened on a Tuesday, when the ventilation system failed, leaving the warehouse in a suffocating, heavy heat that seemed to make the very walls sweat with the residue of old crimes. I was moving a crate of backlogged kits from 2019, when my hand brushed against a standard-issue cardboard box that vibrated with a low, rhythmic thrumming, a pulse that felt disturbingly like a human heartbeat. As my skin made contact with the corrugated surface, the silence of the warehouse was shattered by a sound that didn't come from the air, but from inside my own skull, a soft, ragged intake of breath followed by a woman's whisper, desperate and clear. It wasn't a recording. It was a stolen voice, a fragment of a soul physically trapped within the fibers of the evidence, preserved in a state of perpetual, agonizing mid-sentence. I pulled my hand back, my heart hammering against my ribs, but the whisper lingered like smoke in my mind, a plea for someone to finally listen to the words the justice system had deemed inconclusive. Terrified, yet possessed by a morbid curiosity, I began to touch other boxes in the row, and the warehouse erupted into a psychic cacophony of overlapping testimonies that had been systematically buried. Each box held a different frequency, a muffled scream in a tattered blue dress, a shaky description of a silver car in a pair of broken heels, and the stuttering sob of a teenager trapped in a kit labeled evidence, untested. I realized with a sickening jolt that these weren't just objects. The warehouse was a literal prison for the truths that were too inconvenient for the detectives to prosecute, a place where the essence of the crime was harvested and then discarded. The system hadn't just failed to find the perpetrators, it had physically confiscated the survivors' ability to remember and speak, turning their trauma into a tangible asset that was filed away and forgotten under a layer of bureaucratic dust. I felt like I was standing in a choir of ghosts, a conductor of a symphony of pain that had been muted by the thick, grey walls of the precinct. I spent the next week in a feverish state of internal conflict, my duties at the warehouse now feeling like a daily act of treason against my own kind. I found myself drawn back to the darker corners of the shelves, searching for a specific date, a specific number that had been etched into the back of my mind since the night my own world ended. I knew my case file was here somewhere, buried in the backlog of a precinct that had told me my memory was clouded by shock and that there wasn't enough physical evidence to move forward. I had spent years feeling hollow, a ghost haunting my own life, convinced that I had simply suppressed the details of that night out of self-preservation. But after hearing the voices in the boxes, I began to suspect that my silence wasn't a psychological choice, but a theft, that the words I needed to identify him had been taken from me and filed away in a box I wasn't allowed to open. Finding Sector 7B felt like descending into a deeper circle of hell. The shelves here sagging under the weight of unprocessed sexual assault kits that dated back over a decade. The air was colder here, a biting chill that smelled of old rain and the sharp ozone scent of a coming storm, and my flashlight beam trembled as it swept across the alphanumeric codes. Then I saw it. Case file 8842 Alpha, my own name printed in faded ink on a box that sat at the very bottom of a stack, looking small and insignificant under the weight of 100 other tragedies. As I reached out, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely keep my grip, the warehouse lights flickered and died, leaving me in a total, terrifying darkness that felt like the night it happened. When my hand finally touched the lid, the voice didn't whisper, it screamed a name I had forgotten the moment the detectives closed their notebooks and walked out of the interview room. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow, a technicolor explosion of sensory data that flooded my brain as the box surrendered the stolen fragments of my identity. I wasn't just remembering, I was reliving the humidity of the alleyway, the smell of cheap tobacco on his breath, and the cold weight of the ring on his finger. Details that the system had extracted from my mind during my initial traumatized statement. I saw the face of the man who hurt me, not as a blur, but with a terrifying, high-definition clarity that made me gasp for air, realizing he was someone the precinct knew very well. The box had been a vault for the truth, a way for the city to ensure that I would never be able to testify because the words were no longer in my possession. They were state property, locked in a warehouse I was never supposed to enter. I clutched the box to my chest, the vibrations of my own stolen voice humming through my collarbone, and I knew I couldn't just leave it here to rot. I began to realize that the evidence warehouse was actually a processing plant for silence, where the most damning details were harvested from survivors and replaced with a foggy, manageable sense of closure. The precinct didn't want the kits tested because the kits held more than DNA. They held the psychic weight of the crime, a weight that would crush the comfortable status quo of the city if it were ever released. I looked around at the thousands of boxes, each one a woman's power stripped away and shelved, and a cold, sharp rage began to replace the fear that had defined my life for years. I wasn't just a warehouse clerk anymore. I was a thief in the temple of lies, and I was going to break out with as many voices as I could carry. I began to map the security cameras, noting the blind spots where the guards, men who joked about the smell of old cases, never bothered to look, planning my heist of the century. My plan required me to stay late under the guise of inventory correction, a task so mind-numbing that my supervisor didn't even look up from his phone when I volunteered for the overtime. Armed with a heavy-duty bolt cutter hidden in my tool bag, I moved through the shadows of the shelves, my ears attuned to the whispers of the boxes that seemed to be cheering me on in a low, discordant hum. I reached my box and sliced through the reinforced plastic seal, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the empty warehouse, and as the lid popped open, a surge of raw, unedited emotion poured out. It felt like my soul was being stitched back together in real time, the words I needed to testify flowing back into my throat, hot and sharp, like swallowed glass. But I didn't stop at my own file. I began to unseal the boxes around me, releasing a cascade of voices that began to fill the warehouse with a roaring, invisible storm of truth. The guard's footsteps began to approach, the heavy thud of their boots amplified by the concrete floor. But I didn't run. I stood in the center of the aisle as the whispers turned into a deafening shout. The air in the warehouse began to shimmer with the collective energy of 10,000 inconclusive stories, the static of the stolen voices blowing the fuses of the security cameras one by one. I saw the lead guard round the corner, his hand on his holster, but as he opened his mouth to shout, the voice from a box near him, a voice he likely recognized, screamed his name with such force it knocked him backward. The warehouse was no longer a graveyard. It was an uprising, a rebellion of the evidence that had been told to stay quiet for the sake of the precinct's reputation. I grabbed my file and a handful of others, the paper folders feeling heavy and alive in my hands, and I ran for the emergency exit as the lights began to explode in a shower of sparks. I burst out into the night air, the rain hitting my face with a sweetness I hadn't tasted in years, the voices in my head finally harmonizing into a single, unbreakable resolve. I could hear the alarms blaring behind me, but they sounded small and pathetic compared to the roar of the women whose truths I was currently carrying through the dark. I didn't go home. I went straight to the offices of a journalist I knew had been blacklisted for asking too many questions about the untested kit crisis. As I sat in her dimly lit office, I opened my file and spoke the name of the man who hurt me, the words finally mine again, vibrating with a power that no bolt or seal could ever contain. I realized that breaking into my own history was only the beginning. I was going to burn down the warehouse and everyone who built it, one box at a time. The legal battle that followed was a seismic event that tore through the city's power structure, exposing the evidence extraction program as a systematic tool of state-sponsored gaslighting. Hundreds of women, alerted by the leaks I had provided, began to flood the precinct, demanding the return of their stolen voices and the testing of their long-forgotten kits. The warehouse was cordoned off as a crime scene in its own right, a place where the victim wasn't a person, but the concept of truth itself, and the librarians who managed it were hauled away in handcuffs. I stood on the courthouse steps, the box from Sector 7, B now empty, but for the lingering scent of my own victory, and I looked out at the sea of survivors who were finally finding their own words. The system had tried to turn us into cardboard boxes, but they forgot that a voice, once stolen, only grows louder in the dark. My own attacker, a high-ranking officer whose distinguished career had been built on the silence of women like me, was the first to fall as the DNA evidence finally matched the clarity of my reclaimed memory. Seeing him in the dock, stripped of his uniform and his unearned authority, I felt the last of the static in my mind finally clear, leaving me with a terrifying, to the roar of the women whose truths I was currently carrying through the dark. I didn't go home. I went straight to the offices of a journalist I knew had been blacklisted for asking too many questions about the untested kit crisis. As I sat in her dimly lit office, I opened my file and spoke the name of the man who hurt me, the words finally mine again, vibrating with a power that no bolt or seal could ever contain. I realized that breaking into my own history was only the beginning. I was going to burn down the warehouse and everyone who built it, one box at a time. The legal battle that followed was a seismic event that tore through the city's power structure, exposing the evidence extraction program as a systematic tool of state-sponsored gaslighting. Hundreds of women, alerted by the leaks I had provided, began to flood the precinct, demanding the return of their stolen voices and the testing of their long-forgotten kits. The warehouse was cordoned off as a crime scene in its own right, a place where the victim wasn't a person, but the concept of truth itself, and the librarians who managed it were hauled away in handcuffs. I stood on the courthouse steps, the box from Sector 7, B now empty, but for the lingering scent of my own victory. And I looked out at the sea of survivors who were finally finding their own words. The system had tried to turn us into cardboard boxes, but they forgot that a voice, once stolen, only grows louder in the dark. My own attacker, a high-ranking officer whose distinguished career had been built on the silence of women like me, was the first to fall as the DNA evidence finally matched the clarity of my reclaimed memory. Seeing him in the dock, stripped of his uniform and his unearned authority, I felt the last of the static in my mind finally clear, leaving me with a terrifying, beautiful sense of wholeness. I realized that the stolen voices weren't just about justice. They were about the fundamental right to own one's own story, even the parts that are jagged and painful. The warehouse had been a temple of erasure, but we had turned it into a monument of reclamation, a place where the silence was finally, irrevocably broken. I was no longer the girl who worked in the dark. I was the woman who brought the light, and I was never going to be quiet again. The warehouse was eventually demolished, the shelves torn down, and the boxes moved to a transparent, survivor-led facility where the voices were honored rather than extracted. I kept a single piece of cardboard from my original box, a small, square scrap that I framed and hung in my new office at the Justice Center, a reminder of where I had come from. Every time a new survivor walked through the door, hesitant and hollowed out, I would show them the scrap and tell them that their words weren't lost. They were just waiting to be claimed. We weren't just processing kits anymore. We were restoring identities, ensuring that no woman ever had to walk through a warehouse of her own mind just to find the strength to say, "This happened." The air in the city felt lighter now, the heavy pressure of the unspoken finally lifted by the collective roar of 1,000 truths told at once. I sat on my balcony one evening, the city lights twinkling below like 1,000,000 tiny evidence tags. But they didn't look like threats anymore. They looked like possibilities. Julian, the journalist who had risked everything to help me, sat beside me, and for the first time, we talked about a future that wasn't defined by what had been taken from us. The trauma was still there, a scar in the geography of my soul, but it was a scar I wore with pride, a mark of the woman who had broken into the underworld to bring back her own ghost. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind, hearing not the screams of the warehouse, but the steady, peaceful rhythm of a heart that was finally, truly its own master. The heist was over, and the treasure, my voice, was home for good. The final report on the warehouse scandal was released a year later, a 1,000-page indictment of a culture that prioritized efficiency over humanity, and my name was listed as the primary whistleblower. I didn't care about the fame or the headlines. I cared about the fact that Sector 4 was now a park where children played, and the sun actually hit the ground. I realized that the break-in had been the most honest thing I had ever done, a necessary violation of a corrupt law to serve a higher justice. My history was no longer a cold case, and my future was no longer a mystery. I was Elena, the woman who spoke in the dark until the light finally listened. I looked at the framed scrap of cardboard one last time, whispered, "Thank you to the girl I used to be," and stepped out into the world, ready for whatever words came next. The legal shockwaves from the warehouse heist didn't stop at the precinct's front doors. They rippled upward into the legislative halls of the Capitol, forcing a total re-evaluation of how biological data was defined under the law. I found myself testifying before a Senate subcommittee, my voice steady as I explained how the state had weaponized the extraction of my memory to ensure I remained a non-threat to the status quo. The courtroom was silent as I described the physical sensation of the stolen voices, the low hum of thousands of boxes vibrating with the weight of unprosecuted crimes. And I saw the horror in the eyes of the officials who had spent their careers ignoring the backlog. It wasn't just about a failure of resources. It was about a failure of soul, a systemic decision to treat the testimony of women as a dangerous commodity that needed to be contained and neutralized. I realized then that my heist had done more than just free my own voice. It had shattered the legal framework that allowed the state to own a survivor's history. In the months following my testimony, a shadowy group of former librarians, the men and women who had run the warehouse for decades, tried to discredit me, claiming that the voices were a hallucination brought on by my own trauma. They argued that the high-tech preservation chemicals used in Sector 4 had caused me to suffer from olfactory and auditory delusions, a desperate attempt to pathologize my intuition once again. But their defense crumbled when a group of whistleblowers from the chemical labs came forward, revealing that the preservatives were specifically engineered to trap bioacoustic frequencies within the DNA kits. The corporation that manufactured the storage boxes had been a silent partner in the silencing of thousands, selling the precinct a peace of mind that was literally built on the extracted screams of the victims. I wasn't crazy. I was the first person to stay in that toxic atmosphere long enough to hear the truth through the static of their chemical suppression. The evidence locker scandal led to the creation of the Office of Restorative Evidence, a new branch of justice that was independent of the police department and led entirely by survivors and forensic ethicists. I was asked to serve as the inaugural director, a role that transformed me from a fugitive clerk into a guardian of the city's collective memory. We didn't just move the boxes. We began a revoicing project, using the same technology that once trapped the voices to help survivors reintegrate their memories in a safe, clinical environment. I saw women who had been mute for 20 years walk into our center and, after touching their original files, burst into tears as they finally remembered the names of their children or the color of the sky on the day they were hurt. We weren't just solving crimes. We were returning the missing pieces of human identities that had been stolen by a bureaucracy of cold cardboard and grey tape. Despite my new position, I still suffered from the echo, a psychological side effect of being exposed to so many overlapping testimonies during my final night in the warehouse. Sometimes, when the city grew too quiet, I could still hear the distant choral hum of the women of Sector 4, a ghost frequency that reminded me of the thousands of boxes still buried in other warehouses across the country. I realized that the fight was far from over. The silence industry was a global enterprise, and my city was just one small node in a vast network of suppressed history. I began to coordinate with international human rights groups, sharing the Sector 4 protocols to help them identify the telltale signs of acoustic evidence suppression in their own jurisdictions. I had become a hunter of silences, a woman who looked at a closed case and saw a door that still needed to be kicked in. the man who had been the master librarian. The chief of evidence, who had overseen my extraction, refused to speak during his trial, maintaining a defiant, stony silence that felt like a final insult to the women he had erased. But during the sentencing hearing, the judge allowed me to bring a small, portable acoustic resonator into the courtroom, a device that could play back the residual frequencies of a person's history. I placed the device near him, and the courtroom was suddenly filled with the sound of his own voice from 20 years ago, calmly ordering the deletion of my file and hundreds of others. He couldn't hide behind his silence anymore, because the very technology he used to trap us had recorded his own complicity, turning his perfect system into his ultimate undoing. As he was led away, the sound of the stolen voices followed him out of the room, a phantom jury that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The journalist, Julian, and I eventually uncovered the end-user list for the extracted memories, a discovery that turned the scandal into a full-blown political conspiracy. It turned out that the voices weren't just being stored. They were being sold to data mining firms that used the raw emotional frequencies to train predictive policing AIs to identify vulnerability in the population. The state wasn't just ignoring the crimes, they were profiting from the trauma, using our screams to build a map of who was most likely to stay quiet in the future. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the reason why the warehouse had been so carefully guarded, and why my heist had triggered such a violent corporate response. We were the raw material for a future, where dissent was identified before it was even whispered, all based on the data harvested from our worst nights. The demolition of the original warehouse was televised, a public exorcism that I was invited to trigger with the push of a single red button. As the industrial shelving collapsed, and the dust of 1,000,000 ignored reports rose into the air, I felt a physical weight lift from my chest, a release of tension I hadn't even realized I was holding. The dust settled on the surrounding streets like a grey snow, but it didn't smell like fear anymore. It smelled like the end of a long, dark era of secrecy. We built a garden on the site, a place where the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the voices of people telling their stories in the open air. I spent my weekends there, sitting on the benches and listening to the survivors talk, no longer as patients or victims, but as owners of their own complicated and beautiful lives. My relationship with Julian grew into something deeper, a partnership built on the shared knowledge of the dark and a mutual commitment to the light. He never asked me to move on or to forget, because he understood that the fragments I had reclaimed were now the foundation who I was. We spent our evenings in his office, surrounded by the archives of the revolution we had started, documenting the stories of the second wave of survivors who were finally coming forward. We knew that the system would always try to rebuild itself, to find new ways to extract and silence, but we were ready for it. We were the guardians of the frequencies now, and we knew exactly what to listen for. One evening, a young woman walked into the Restorative Evidence Center holding a small, tattered photograph, the only thing she had left of her mother, who had disappeared in the early 90s. She told me that the police had lost the file, but she had heard a hum coming from a locked door in the back of the local precinct's basement. I looked into her eyes and saw the same desperate flickering light that had guided me through Sector 4, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I grabbed my inventory bag, which still held the heavy bolt cutters from that fateful Tuesday, and I offered her a seat and a glass of water. "Don't worry," I told her, my voice clear and certain. We're going to go get her voice back together. The fight moved into the digital realm as we realized that the new warehouses were cloud-based, where testimonies were being encrypted beyond the reach of the survivors themselves. I recruited a team of acoustic hackers, women who knew how to find the hidden frequencies in the binary code and turn them back into human speech. We launched a series of digital heists, liberating terabytes of suppressed data and returning it to the women who had been told their memories were corrupted files. The evidence warehouse was no longer a physical building, but we were no longer just physical thieves. We were the ghosts in the machine, the glitch that refused to be patched out. My story was no longer a memoir. It was a manual for a new kind of resistance. I received a letter from a woman in another country who had read about the Elena files and had used the information to find her own stolen history in a government archive. She sent me a recording of her own reclaimed voice, a sound so full of life and defiance that it made me weep for the beauty of what we had accomplished. It was the first of many such letters, a global chorus of reclamation that proved that the silence industry was finally on its knees. We were building a new world, one where the evidence locker was an open door, and the librarians were the people who actually lived the stories. I realized that my heist hadn't just changed my life, it had changed the very frequency of the planet. As I approached my 50th birthday, I sat in the park where the warehouse once stood and watched the sunset, the colors bleeding across the sky in a way that no chemical preservative could ever capture. I felt a sense of peace that was so profound it almost felt like a new kind of trauma, the trauma of finally being allowed to be happy. I looked at the scrap of cardboard in my hand, the one from case file 8842 Alpha, and I realized I didn't need it anymore. I walked over to the memorial fountain, laid the scrap on the surface of the water, and watched as the ink dissolved and the fibers broke apart, finally returning to the earth. I was no longer defined by the box I had been kept in. I was defined by the space I had cleared for others to breathe. The stolen voices were now a permanent part of the city's curriculum, taught in schools as a reminder of the period when we almost lost our humanity to the pursuit of a perfect justice. I was invited to speak at the opening of the Global Archive of Reclaimed Truth, a facility built entirely of glass to ensure that no shadow could ever hide a box again. I stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces that were no longer clouded by the static of suppression. And I didn't need a script or a resonator to be heard. I just spoke from the heart, my voice carrying across the crowd with a frequency that was entirely my own. The air was clear, the warehouse was gone, and the silence was finally, perfectly broken. Julian held my hand as we walked home that night, the city humming with a new kind of energy, the sound of 1 million people living their own truths without fear. I realized that the greatest heist I had ever pulled wasn't stealing the boxes, it was stealing the future back from those who wanted to sell it. I was a woman who had lived 1,000 lives in a single warehouse, but I was finally ready to just live my own. The evidence was everywhere now, in the laughter of the children, the debates in the town square, and the quiet, honest conversations on every street corner. I was Elena, and I was finally, truly, heard. In the very last moment of the day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I thought I heard a faint, distant whisper on the wind, a sound like a single satisfied thank you. I smiled, closed my eyes, and let the sound carry me into a deep, dreamless sleep, knowing that the silent housekeeper of my mind was finally at rest. There were no more boxes to open, no more files to steal, and no more names to reclaim. The symphony was complete, and the music was mine to keep forever. I was home, and the world was loud and beautiful and free. The warehouse heist didn't just break a lock, it shattered a global paradigm of institutionalized gaslighting. In the years that followed, the evidence extraction scandal became the catalyst for a total overhaul of survivor rights, leading to the permanent closure of every storage facility across the nation. I watched from the front lines as the systems built to profit from our silence were dismantled, replaced by transparent, survivor-led archives where truth was treated as a human right rather than a state-owned commodity. The heavy, metallic scent of the warehouse was finally replaced by the fresh air of accountability, a scent that felt like the first breath of a new life. I eventually transitioned from the director of the Restorative Evidence Center to a life of quiet advocacy, traveling the world to help other nations identify the telltale static of suppressed history. My work took me to the corners of the earth where voices were still being harvested, and with every box I helped open, a piece of the world's collective soul felt more whole. I became a master of the acoustic resonance technology, no longer using it to steal, but to heal, teaching others how to tune into their own intuition to find the memories that had been stolen. I was no longer a victim of a crime. I was the architect of a revolution that prioritized the human heart over a high-tech cage. My relationship with Julian remained my anchor, a bond forged in the fires of a shared conspiracy and tempered by the peace of the aftermath. We built a home far from the digital gaze of the city, a place where the only heartbeat that mattered was the one pulsing rhythmically in my own chest. We spent our evenings not in the pursuit of secrets, but in the enjoyment of the unrecorded, understanding that the most precious parts of life are those that never make it into a data mining algorithm. He was the witness to my joy, just as the warehouse had been the witness to my pain, and in the balance between the two, I found a life worth living. As the master librarian and his cohorts withered away in prison, their perfect system became a cautionary tale taught to every new generation of law students. The Elena files became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that no amount of chemical suppression or bureaucratic walls can ever truly kill a woman's voice. The legacy of Sector 4 was no longer one of tragedy, but of the immense power that comes when a person decides they have had enough of being a closed case. We turned the graveyard of sorrows into a garden of justice, ensuring that the ground where the boxes once sat would forever grow something vibrant and loud. The echo that had haunted me for years eventually faded into a soft, melodic hum, a sign that the collective trauma I had absorbed was finally finding its own peace. I realized that the voices weren't haunting me anymore. They were accompanying me, a choir of 10,000 sisters who walked beside me in every room I entered. I no longer felt the need to look over my shoulder for the men who wanted me silent, because I knew the world was now listening with ears that had been opened by the truth. My identity was no longer a set of stolen fragments, but a masterpiece I had painted myself, with the colors I reclaimed from the dark. On my final visit to the memorial park built on the warehouse site, I sat by the fountain and watched a young survivor tell her story to a group of listeners, her voice clear and unbroken by fear. I realized then that my mission was complete. The torch of truth had been passed to a new generation who would never allow a warehouse to be built again. I stood up, left my old librarian badge on the bench, and walked toward the exit without looking back. The story wasn't about the box anymore. It was about the freedom of the woman who walked out of it. I am Elena, and my history is no longer state property. It is a story written in the quiet, beautiful freedom of being known only to myself and those I choose to love. The silence is gone, the static is dead, and the world is finally, perfectly, loud. I live now in the unrecorded silence of the forest, where the only thing that needs monitoring is the growth of the trees and the steady, peaceful beat of my own reclaimed heart. I am whole, I am heard, and I am finally free.